Greetings and welcome back to room 303 and our talks with Walt. And we now turn in Leaves of Grass, the Deathbed Edition, to the classic starting from Paumanok. Now, I want to say right away three important things before we even get into this conversation. This is an introductory lecture. We have 19 sections of this poem, which is obviously going to make this the longest poem in Leaves of Grass to date. And I want to talk a little bit about how we're going to approach our study. With that in mind, we've got to right away get Paumanok out of the way. So write this one down. Paumanok is the Native American name for Long Island, which is, of course, where Whitman was born, and Whitman spent so much of his life. So we are starting from Paumanok, that is to say, Whitman will review his life in this classic poem. Now, we've read all of the 24 poems of inscriptions to help us prepare for this now somewhat long poem, but think of this. This poem of 19 sections, called Starting from Paumanok, sits right before the most famous of the poems of Leaves of Grass, Song of Myself, those 52 sections. So I like to say to students that we learn how to read Starting from Paumanok by doing the 24 short poems of inscription, with the exception of the Eidolon's poem, as we've said in an earlier lecture. And we'll read the 19 sections of Starting from Paumanok to get ready to read Song of Myself. Now, once you've read Song of Myself, you're almost technically halfway through Leaves of Grass. And we'll talk about why I said technically that's the case. In terms of the longer poems, once you've read Song of Myself, then you know how to read a long poem by Whitman. Now, to be fair, it really is poems within poems. And that embedded word picture is going to be central to our thinking about this one starting from Paumanok. Now, I want to review the assumptions that are a part of our lectures here at LearnStrong.net. My assumption is that you've been with me through the introductory lectures on Whitman, through those 24 poems of the inscriptions chapter, as we will call it, or section. And I'm hoping that you've been following our stuff that way. If you haven't, hit LearnStrong.net, down the left-hand side, find our link called Talks with Walt, and that way you can at least be caught up, because I will be making lots and lots of references to a lot of those poems from earlier in Leaves of Grass. Of course, I want to as well, as we begin our conversations of the 19 sections of this poem, remind us why we're here. We are the stories that we tell. We're the stories we retell. We're the stories we decide to accept, and of course, the stories we decide to reject. We're going to hear a whole lot about that in Starting from Paumanok. We've already heard a lot about that in our previous lectures. And to that degree, I want to remind us of our learning theory. It's always our goal to connect new information to old information in meaningful ways. That is to say, the new, N-E-W, is the new, K-N-E-W. It's all kind of cyclical. And so we're paying attention in our learning theory to what is said in Starting from Paumanok that will help us be able to read what's coming in Song of Myself and elsewhere later in Leaves of Grass. But also we want to pay reference to all these poems that are part of the inscriptions chapter. Now, I'm not going to say this at the beginning of every one of the 19 sub-lectures that have to do with each section, so I'm doing it here to remind. We're always messing around with our annotative approach. We ask three guiding questions. At level 1, what does the text say? At level 2, what does the text mean? At level 3, how can I relate to this information in some meaningful way? At level 1, summarizing. Basically, what's the poem say? Or what's the small section of Starting from Paumanok say? At level 2, how can I, in some ways, understand better? I'm now working with it to a themes, messages, and it to be, this is critical for us, not what Whitman says, but how Whitman says it. That rhetorical approach, okay? And we'll be looking at his poetic techniques, as of course we've been looking at the prior poems as well. Now at level 3, and that's where we own the text as we say it in 303, we are hoping at 3A that we can relate this text we're studying to other texts we know. Now our word text is inclusive. We mean everything from other poems in Leaves of Grass, to other literary texts, to stuff that we've watched or even listened to. For us, a piece of music is a text. So any kind of important song, whether it be classical or rap, is going to be for us an important text. And we will always be asking about any other text that we know, what can I say as related to this? And then finally, of course, at 3B, how can I relate this information to myself? Hey guys, look, don't take Leaves of Grass as somehow a significant text because this crazy old man says so. Rather, I would say, pick up the text, read it yourself, and decide, is it worth my time? Do I accept the story or reject the story? I might accept the story partially, I might reject the story partially. You hearing me? But my challenge to you is, let's read starting from Paumanok this way. Now, to be fair, this is not a well-known poem, as is, for example, Song of Myself, or Song of the Open Road, or I Hear America Singing. When you talk about Whitman in Leaves of Grass, starting from Paumanok is usually not one of the poems until you studied it. And once you study it, you'll go, oh, everything in Leaves of Grass is somehow connected with this set of lines, which is why it sits where it sits in the deathbed edition of Leaves of Grass. Now, we're going to talk, of course, in a bit about some of that background information. Now, let's just remind ourselves, finally, of the assumptions of our Big Five, as we call them, in 303. That is to say, about any text we're studying, we ask five, I think, really interesting questions. What does the text say about epistemology, what we can know? That absolutist position, I'm right, you're wrong, absolutely. Or the relativist position, there are no truths at all, which starts to sound like a truth. And because we jettison both of those ideas, we seek the fallibilist position epistemologically, which, by the way, Whitman in large measure delivers to the American psyche. This is why Americans are so often of that fallibilist ilk, epistemologically speaking. What is it? I think I'm right, but I could be wrong. It's that I could be wrong that always allows, for example, our two-party system politically. Think about the power of a two-party system, because no matter how convinced you are politically, you could be wrong. That's the point of the other party. And so foundationally, we're always asking about our epistemological groundings or moorings. Our second of the Big Five is, of course, ontology. Not necessarily we're always going to answer this in Whitman, but we're certainly going to resurrect the question, who are you? And Whitman will begin that question by asking, who am I? So the study of being is ontology. Of course, our third and our fourth will go together. Psychology, the study of the individual mind. Sociology, the study of the collective mind. There is a dance, I would put this in your notes. There is a dance in Whitman between those two. There is a tension there that obviously makes the dance so beautiful and at times so treacherous. Because on the one hand, I'm an American, leave me alone, I'll do whatever I want. On the other hand, I belong to a nation of like-minded thinkers. That's that tension between psychology and sociology. We're going to see a lot of that in starting from Paumanok. And then finally, the question of theodicy. Why is it that terrible things have to happen? Whitman knew a thing or two about that. How do I live with the pain of this world? And when bad things happen, Whitman reminds us, we can't ask, why did this happen to me? That's a stupid and a silly question because it's an unanswerable question. Although it's the instinctive question, we have to learn to ask, why did this happen for me? That is to say, pain, suffering, is propedeutic. It's instructional. How can it help us? We're going to see some of that, obviously, in this poem as well. Finally, we're looking at Whitman from 5 different perspectives. Now, dude, there's way more than 5 Whitmans. There's a whole bunch of Whitmans, but for sure there's 5. Namely, Whitman as a person. I've already mentioned, born in Paumanok. But we obviously would think of Whitman as poet, so that's our second one. Why would he use the word starting from Paumanok? Like, why wouldn't he use another term, like Long Island, for example? Like, why play these games with these terms? Of course, Whitman, a pedagogue or instructor or teacher, we've seen quite a bit of this already in our earlier studies. And then, of course, Whitman as politician, his love of democracy. We're going to see it a lot there. And then finally, Whitman as philosopher. From Socrates, even the pre-Socratics, on up through Emerson, he is a great lover of philosophy as well. Now, let's begin with some background information. As we often do, we will resort to our Nortons to tell us a little bit about this poem. So I'm just going to share a few things with you about the origination of this poem. The introductory poem of the 1860 edition, starting from Paumanok, right? Under the title, though, Proto-Leaf. It's a fervent announcement of the poet's theme and purpose, and it was originally entitled Premonition. Very interesting. Also, it contains, from Walt Whitman's notebooks of 1856, many first draft lines from this poem, whose composition was begun immediately after the appearance of the first edition of Leaves of Grass. It's almost like in 1855 he writes his poems, his book, as he'll call it, his book, and then he starts to think already about how to expand it, how to grow it, and we'll get a sense of the growing nature in this set of lines, no question. Its present title, starting from Paumanok, first appeared in the 1867 edition, which contains more revisions than any other. These revisions are of considerable interest and should be studied. The poem was placed in its present position immediately following the inscriptions group in Leaves of Grass, 1871. It is itself, now to finish Norton's, an extended inscription, as the original title's premonition and proto-leaf obviously suggest. It's much more, however, than just an announcement of intent. Like Song of Myself, which obviously we'll study next, right? It's both a mythic and personal portrait of the poet, the new man of the Western world. End quote. Now, that will be significant for us in our study as we move forward. I want to share with you Jerome Loving's ideas, the great biographer of Whitman. He says it this way. Not that Whitman didn't attempt to stay on the editorial side of journalism. He resorted to freelancing, something he hadn't done on a steady basis since his star days. Between October and January of 1850, he published 10 crucial essays under the general heading of, quote, Letters from a Traveling Bachelor, end quote, in the New York Standard Dispatch. Perhaps, to avoid the evil eye of the eagle, Whitman's September puff may have appeared in the Sunday Dispatch. He signed these letters Paumanok. His use of the Indian name for Long Island had the effect of a double entendre, evoking the place and its poet. It never became Whitman's nickname, as the Raven becomes Poe's for a time, but the spirit of the word is embedded in Leaves of Grass and, of course, starting from Paumanok. Now, with this in mind, let's talk now to finish real quickly about how we will approach our study. Now, we've got 19 sections. We want to do annotations over each of those sections. I'm going to go one section at a time. Okay, so for each of my lectures, we're going to play the same game we played in inscriptions lectures. I'm going to look at the poem. We're going to exegete as we go using our annotative approach. Now, we're going to start by starting, which makes sense given, of course, the title of the poem itself. This is, again, just for a few more now introductory notes. It's another introduction. It's almost as if Whitman says, now that I've introduced myself, let me introduce myself. Or maybe more importantly, now that I've introduced myself, let me introduce my project, which is myself. Namely, what it is I'm hoping to accomplish, especially because in 1855, he did not have the inscriptions poems, 24 of them, nor did he have the 19 sections of Paumanok. He started with Song of Myself. And it is true that a lot of people picked up Song of Myself. Are you ready for this? They weren't quite sure how to read it. Part of the problem of being rejected, I would say, is just simple confusion. Like, what am I looking at? This doesn't even look like poetic lines, much less sound like poetry. It can't be poetry, and it's far too obscene in some ways. It's far too confusing and challenging to be considered legitimate poetry. So I think Whitman wrote, starting from Paumanok, to say, I need to explain to you what my real project is, and this is how I'm going to do it. All of the major themes of learning of Leaves of Grass will be here. They're going to be treated one way or the other. Obviously, we're going to look at this. Once we finish the 19 sections of this project, we then can, I hope, pick up the 52 sections of Song of Myself, and we can go to work with it. Now, some have called this, scholars, Whitman's literary manifesto at the beginning of the collection of poems. As we've mentioned, his use of Paumanok as being his birthplace is significant. So not only are we starting literally in our birth in Long Island, but of course he spent so much of his life there celebrating, obviously, the region that we will know so well today and so beloved today is that area that he made most famous in American thought in large measure, right? Now here, in some ways, think of it. We have the modern Odyssey. Okay, here it is. This is it. In other words, this is Odysseus starting out. Now you can either think of him as starting out from Ithaca sailing to Troy, or you can think of him starting out at Troy sailing to Ithaca. Either way, it's the journey that matters, not the destination. And to that degree, think about lines like, strike up for a new world. We're literally going to hear this phrase in the poem itself, strike up for a new world. Whitman, of course, writing at a very interesting time, as we've said already, a time when America is full of dynamic, what's his word, urging that we learned from our study in inscriptions. Now, of course, here we're going to hear the Categories Project. All these listings of place and names. I mean, we start with Paumanok already. Notice the genius of saying starting from Paumanok. What's that mean? Already, he's got you. So, in other words, a good reader will say, Paumanok, what's a Paumanok? No, it's not a what, it's a where. Although technically it is a what as well. Technically, it's also a who, because Paumanok will in some ways be Whitman, and Whitman will be Paumanok. Of course, the listings of peoples, machines, actions, In some ways, he wants to catalog instead of master, and then in other ways, he's going to find remarkable ways to spin all this stuff together to say, let me tell you what America is. America is you, and then America is us, and then America is somehow the tension between you and us. And that ain't changed since he published this poem, as we obviously will play games with. Now we're going to hear about all kinds of purposes of poetry as well in this, and somehow he's going to try to be, as iconoclast as he is, defiant to the ways that it used to be. And of course, as we've said, he's a contemporary of Longfellow. Tell me not in wonderful numbers, life is but an empty dream. He's not playing games like that, but we will sense rhythm. And of course, he loves what Longfellow's attempting in a poem like Psalm of Life. Let us then be up and doing with a heart for any fate, still achieving, still pursuing, learn to labor and to wait. That idea of struggle is going to be central as well. But we're going to see a very different kind of poet and a poetic project here, right? Now again, as we've said, Whitman living during a very, very turbulent time in America. As he said, my book and the war are one. Elsewhere, he said that in inscriptions. The Civil War defined us as people. It defined Whitman as person and as poet, and obviously we're going to see quite a bit of that here. Finally, Whitman is great respecter. And this is why I love to teach Whitman, because he reminds us we're all in this project together, and because we're all in this project together, everything has relevance. You'll remember Tennyson says in Ulysses, I'm a part of all that I have met, yet all experience is an arch where through gleams that untraveled world whose margin fades forever and forever when I move. To follow knowledge like a sinking star beyond the utmost bounds of human thought is the way that Tennyson will say it. And Whitman loved that poem, and he loved the idea. Everything has relevance. Everything will get thrown into Leaves of Grass, and we're going to see that project starting right now. Let's turn to part one, starting from Paumanok, Talks with Walt. Let's go on a journey, shall we? Thank you.